In addition to serving as the board president of the Indiana Medical History Museum, Dr. Schultz is also a professor of English at IUPUI with appointments in history and the medical humanities. Women at the Front, Hospital Workers in Civil War America was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2004 and was one of 3 finalists for the Lincoln Prize. And this made her the national authority on Civil War nursing. In 2011, she published This Birthplace of Souls, one of the last extant nursing diaries of the war, a book about New England's Harriet Eaton and her travails in camp and field with the Maine Infantry Regiment. From 2014 to 2017, Dr. Schultz was a historical consultant for the PBS drama Mercy Street about a Civil War hospital in Virginia. In 2019, her edition of Sarah Edmonds' controversial narrative, Nurse and Spy in the Union Army, was released by Lakeside Press. And Dr. Schultz is currently chipping away at Lead, Blood, and Ink, a study of wartime surgical language and culture. She co-edits the Manchester University Book Press series on nursing history and humanities and has written widely on cancer memoirs and other kinds of illness narratives. So I will turn things over to Jane now. Any moment. There she is. Jane, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Finally got some success here. All right, well, I'm gonna bow out now and let Jane do all the talking. So thank you all again for coming. Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
I will be able to momentarily. I'm going to say a couple of things first. So,
Gotcha.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in on Mother's Day for this talk on Nightingale. I'm so sorry that we cannot all be together in one space, but at least we can be together in real time. I want to begin by thanking the many people who have helped me begin to sort out Florence Nightingale's impact on nursing via visual culture. That starts with IUPUI librarians Christy Palmer and Jemica Piper, librarians Philip Siegel and Teresa Dougherty at London's Royal College of Nursing, David Green, who directs the Florence Nightingale Museum in London, Dr. Jonathan Memel of Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincolnshire and his colleagues at the University of Nottingham, who have been working on a national United Kingdom sponsored fellowship during this bicentenary year of Nightingale's birth. And I want to also thank my co-editor in the University of Manchester's Nursing History and Humanities book series, Christine Hallett, and finally an assortment of archivists at the Wellcome Library and the London Metropolitan Archives, which hold early materials from the original Nightingale School at St. Thomas's Hospital. And of course, I'm still in medias res, in progress with them, working on trying to get a lot of this research wrapped up. As always, my thanks go to Sarah Halter and Kathy Hull, whose labors are admirable and who have brought the Medical History Museum into its own during this past decade. And of course, thanks to the Lande family for sponsoring this lecture and the annual lecture that we have at the Medical History Museum every year. This lecture is an abbreviated form of a longer paper that I gave in Florence, Italy in February regarding, let's see here, do this regarding, let's see here, 1 second. Okay, where is our slideshow? Let's find it. I'm not getting the screen that I thought I would have here, so let me just Hang on one second. I'm looking for my slideshow. There it is. Okay. All right, this should get us started here. As I started to say, this lecture is a part of a talk that I gave in February at the European Conference of Nursing Historians. And it happened literally just before the country closed down for COVID-19. So you can imagine that that made a lot of people at that conference anxious, but that's where things began. Let me begin by observing that Nightingale's influence on nursing practice and professionalism has long been debated. This focus on Nightingale, due largely to her remarkable productivity in print culture, has led, I believe, to some unanticipated consequences in nursing's historiography. Our analysis of her rich textual record, much of it constituting letters written in bed while she recovered from a bacterial infection that we believe she got in the Crimea, has sometimes eclipsed the role played by other early contributors to nursing who were instrumental in establishing the profession. It's a gap that has recently been addressed in a book on the Crimean War's multinational nursing presence. A less obvious result of Nightingale's epistolary and documentary windfall has been our tendency to think about her perhaps too narrowly as an individual whose actions and intentions laid out the terms of nursing education in the West, rather than as a cultural icon who had little control over the disposition and dissemination of her image. Nightingale was famously uneasy about her celebrity and about putting her image before the public, reactions that were well within the bounds of Victorian propriety for elite women, and which some have regarded as masking more assertive qualities. But in an era of technological innovation that featured the rise of photography and the mass market circulation of news, the woman who had become Britain's nurse could scarcely dodge this flood of interest. It is the physical image of Nightingale that concerns me here. How her image was shared, distributed, and read by diverse publics. What can we learn about the development and public awareness of nursing as a profession from the tracks left by Nightingale's image? How did the growth of photography and the reproduction of illustrations from the 1850s onward contribute to the image's public saturation? And how did these technologies instantiate popular cultural platforms that caused groups of Nightingale admirers to coalesce? Finally, how did mid-19th century innovations in visual and pictorial forms of communication set in motion public assumptions about what constituted appropriate nursing and the kind of individual best suited to become a nurse? With this research, I want to suggest some ways that we can use Nightingale's image and visual culture more generally to enhance our understanding of pictorial forms on the establishment of nursing as a profession. A continuing challenge in assembling this portrait of Nightingale is that the current location of her images does not always reveal the image's original provenance. We often know the names of the painters, sculptors, lithographers, and photographers who produced her likeness, and the military settings in which her work was imagined, but we don't always know how such works were commissioned and where they originally resided. More importantly, we lack complete data about how and how often the images circulated and about audience reception. In the case of photographs in particular, and we have precious few of Nightingale before 1860, we know that photos did not regularly circulate in newspapers in the 1850s, and that, as Jakob Bettkes's work on technology in the Crimean War has alerted us, readers were more likely to see wood engravings and lithographs in the news because photography had still not advanced to the stage where photos were easily reproducible in mass media. Still, photographic documentation of the Crimean War by Roger Fenton raised British and global consciousness about what could be seen and what was seeable at a battlefront. As an evolving art form, photographs coached viewers who perused public exhibits to look and interpret more immediately and more transparently. Photographs introduced a third dimension to what was often a flattened looking image in prints, thus making war scenes appear more directly accessible to those who cared to look. Not surprisingly, this new form of access both positively and adversely affected public opinion, persuading large numbers of the need for sanitary care and relief, but also intensifying displeasure with the British government's prosecution of the war. Because photography allowed readers to newly participate in measuring and interpreting war's impact on individuals, its evolution as a social technology had the potential to circulate Nightingale's image quickly and intensively. And while this dissemination moved slowly in the 1850s, it picked up speed in the 1860s, which I'll address presently. So what do we know about Nightingale's imprint in the 1850s press? Given today's digital revolution, we can search 19th century British and American periodical archives in some detail to assemble evidence of how often Nightingale's name and activities appeared in print before a public readership. In other words, not her literal image, but reference to her in language, which constitutes another type of imagery. We know, for example, that from the end of the Crimean War to early 1861, before the start of the American Civil War, articles about Nightingale appeared at least 242 times in several highly tracked British periodicals, and about twice as many times in American periodicals, bigger country, more periodicals. The New York Times alone featured 58 articles about her in this period, primarily historical and biographical. But by the early 1860s, the number of references in American periodicals and papers roughly doubled and remained steadily on the upswing in the British press. We begin to see Nightingale's name and reputation invoked with blatant commercial intent, such as an 1858 advertisement for Appleton's gift books, a genre pitched to women and filled with inspirational fiction and poetry, which used an illustration of Nightingale, an angel of goodness, as you can see in the fine print there, to solicit sales. On that list is also Joan of Arc. I thought it was quite interesting, and Lady Jane Grey, of all people. Okay, well, we also know that Nightingale refused the first couple of requests that she received to be photographed, and she declined a publisher's request for an account of her work in the Crimea early on. Though she eventually relented on sitting for portraits, her demurral likely enhanced public interest in her scarcity, increasing her mystery. I think we could call this anachronistically the Salman Rushdie effect. Though Nightingale's image was among America's favorite mid-century imports, a subject that I argue in a 2014 essay, impelled women from Maine to South Carolina to volunteer for relief services in the Civil War, British papers also kept her at the center of public attention for at least a decade after the Crimean War ended. An article in Reynolds' Miscellany of Romance, General Literature, Science and Art included an illustration of Nightingale engraved in 1855, but reaching back to 1850 when she acquired a baby owl during a trip to Greece. By 1855, Nightingale's Crimean image was pretty well known, but there were no likenesses of her childhood or adolescent years in circulation. What looks like an attempt on Reynolds' part to give the icon a past demonstrates a post hoc reality parallel to today's fandom platforms. Nightingale's predisposition to nurture is highlighted in this image, as is her connection to Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, for who this owl was named. The centrality of the naked hand, rather risque for mid-century viewers, to say nothing of her direct gaze, suggests both competency and demureness, qualities that Reynolds could scarcely have predicted would trouble nursing's professional aspirations in the 1860s and 70s. Because much of the periodical coverage of Nightingale did not feature her physical image, it is important to consider how print content worked in tandem with illustrations to create what one observer has called the cult following that trailed Nightingale in mass media in the 1850s. After several depictions of her in Crimean sick wards, in black and white here and in color, after several of these were published in an 1855 number of the illustrated London News, here's yet another, and a color lithograph in Paris the next year, shown here, very similar to the first two. It didn't take long for the idea of the lady with the lamp to catch on. Whereas linguistic images usually precede visual ones, we have the reverse here, where depictions of Nightingale's oil lamp at Scutari became the inspiration for Longfellow's poem Santa Filomena, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1857, 2 years after the first visual images circulated. The saintly warrior imagery in these lines contributed to a growing mythology of nurses as paragons of moral virtue, much of which was promoted by Nightingale herself, in contrast to the more decrepit fictional version that Dickens had offered to readers via Martin Chuzzlewit's Sari Gamp in the 1840s. Historian Michael Wilson succinctly poses the diagnostic dilemma apparent in the relationship between visual and linguistic imagery. How are we to apprehend the multiple relations between words and images, language and the pictorial, he asks. Dominic Lopez's work in the philosophy of aesthetics assembles a theory of how the process of depiction functions. His book, Understanding Pictures, rests on the idea that linguistic depiction has an infinite potential to describe, whereas pictorial depiction is reined in by limits that depend on viewers' broad consensus about what an image represents. In this sense, the pictorial image becomes a visual shorthand that bookends meaning rather than opening out into an infinite number of meanings. This limiting property of the visual image is helpful in considering Nightingale's pictorial impact on viewers' recognition and discernment, because seeing the image generated reactions that connected it instantly to the good work Nightingale was believed to have performed in the Crimea. Counterintuitively, the limited number of pictorial representations of her only fed her popularity, even as these rare images circulated scores of time in media during the decade from 1855 to 1865. It is a further irony that despite her reluctance to appear in the spotlight during and after the war, she was perhaps the most visually represented woman in 19th century Britain, not because of a wealth of images, but because of a paucity of images widely circulated in newspapers, books, periodicals, and public exhibits. Images like this one of Nightingale in the photographer's studio in the 1860s are unusual because the no-nonsense gaze-forward aspect captures something utterly candid and arresting. Other photos look staged and artificial. This one Here's another, conveying conventionally the iconic Nightingale of viewers' expectations, especially, I think, this one, with a modest posture and downcast glance. A more critical perspective suggests a Nightingale weary of fighting Britain's medical establishment, which is legendary, and of course, a Nightingale who was also physically ill. Both the candid and staged poses of the 1860s fed a now international juggernaut to confer heroism on a woman, a brand of heroism that put the nurture of the sick and disabled into the hands of a woman, and that tickled the boundaries of acceptable conduct through sanitary ingenuity and intellectual achievement without upsetting Victorian expectations about female propriety. Crucially, the opposing tensions that constituted this complex image did not regard sacrificial heroism and consequential illness as mutually exclusive states of being, as Mark Bostridge and some of Nightingale's other biographers have revealed. We've looked at lithographs and photographs, which became increasingly reproducible as photographic techniques advanced in the 1860s and later on. But other images of Nightingale existed in the oil paintings produced by British painter Jerry Barrett in the late 1850s, and seen by thousands of Londoners who visited the National Gallery. I'm going to come back to this image in just a moment. But first, I want to show you Barrett's contemporaneous painting of Queen Victoria visiting the wounded in Crimea, which juxtaposed the two women, Queen Victoria and Nightingale, in the popular mind, and implied that Nightingale's power as a healer of bodies was tantamount to the Queen's role as healer of the nation. If you have followed casualty and mortality statistics from the Crimean War, you know that Nightingale had little to brag about given the sanitary practices in the era before the germ theory was understood. The reality of her effectiveness, however, had little to do with public perceptions of her efficacy, and comparisons to Queen Victoria raised her profile considerably. This was good, of course, for nursing as a profession, because such imagery prompted Britain's young women to emulate the model of care so publicly valued. Barrett prepared a study for the Nightingale painting in 1856, which shows a wounded soldier reclining in the shadows right there, if you can see him. You can just barely see his face right here. It shows Nightingale presiding right here, right? Holding a kind of handkerchief, it looks like right there, which marked her status as genteel, but also served as the caregiver's barrier against offensive smells. This is quite common in the sick room, that you would see women who were taking care of people in their homes or in a hospital setting, or even in a field setting like Nightingale, using that just as a barrier against very bad air. I guess we could call it yesterday's version of the N95 mask. Now back to the original painting from the study. Nightingale's entourage here of surgeons, orderlies, assistants, and officers has grown in the completed 1857 work. But now the patient looks up at her and extends his arm for a cup of water offered by a female assistant. These gestures are reminiscent, I think, of sacred portraiture, where the suffering Christ regards Mary or angelic surrogates beatifically. Women, including a nun to Nightingale's right, are more prominent in the finished piece than in the study, suggesting that, at least in Barrett's conception, women belonged in a scene like this for their moral and spiritual guidance. Modern Londoners would have recognized in this canvas nursing centrality to the war effort through Nightingale's image. Even before audiences could view Barrett's painting in public exhibitions, Italian sculptor Alessandro Parlanti produced a marble bust of Nightingale in 1855. Against her better instincts, Nightingale rationalized sitting for him because she believed that men in arms would be inclined to remember their womenfolk. Her words, which you'll see here at the bottom, I really have a scruple against sitting. I only consented to the steel bust because the soldiers asked for it, and thinking of me makes them think of their wives and mothers. So these words, I think, suggest her reluctance. But Nightingale really understood just months after leaving the Crimea that she was more than a literal figurehead. She saw herself as a symbolic exemplar of the soldier's attachment to home and hearth. And then some years later, in 1862, the English sculptor Robert Steele had cast the bust in bronze, this image that you have before you. I'm not sure what happened to the marble that was produced by Parlanti. I've been looking for that, but it's something I haven't been able to track down yet. Later sculptural images, which do not actually contribute to nursing's professional rise in the 1860s and 70s, attest both to the staying power of the icon and the shifting foundations of memory. Though I won't spend much time talking about these later images, I wanted to show you first a bas-relief of Nightingale in St. Thomas's Hospital, the original site of the nurse training school that Nightingale established as she took to her bed after the Crimean War, trying to recover from the illness. I'm struck by the physical contact in this bas-relief between nurse and patient, not because it hadn't occurred throughout Nightingale's months in the Crimea, but because such bodily intimacy could not be pictured until the 20th century. You'll notice in essentially every image that I've shown you so far that there is no physical touch, no physical contact between the nurse and patients. We see Nightingale holding that lamp and patients all aligned in their beds and so forth, but there's no physical contact at all. I think this is something that people were only more comfortable with as time went on and well into the 20th century. This is a World War I era bas-relief. A more heroic and antiseptic rendering is Arthur Walker's monument to Nightingale in Waterloo Place. Perhaps some of you have seen this very, very tall, statuesque Nightingale. It's completed close to the centenary of Nightingale's birth. Commissioned by the Royal College of Nursing, the monument makes use of the iconic power of the lady with the lamp, already well established in the 19th century. Here she is, of course, standing tall and austere with, I think, what I would call her unflinching regard. The images in which Nightingale looks straight out at people are, they are quite striking in the fact that she appears to be very strong and unflinching in these pictures, rather than the pictures in which she's looking down and not actually addressing the viewer. There are also friezes in Waterloo Place that accompany this monument, and they testify to the hands-on scenes of action in which nurses are ensconced, the sign of what became a more fully embodied and representable example in the 20th century. But these, of course, could not be so suggestively pictured during the Victorian era, as I've just said. Well, the last image I want to show you is a moving image sponsored in 2019 by the pharmaceutical conglomerate Johnson & Johnson. It's both oddly appropriate and suspect as Nurses Appreciation Week ends. The videographers began nursing history in this video with the Crimean War and Nightingale, which is only a half-truth, since organized nursing existed in religious orders and plenty of other places. For example, before the mandate to professionalize nursing came about in 1860 and beyond. It really wasn't until about 1870 in the United States. Take a look and see how Nightingale is represented here, and then we'll chat about it.
During the Crimean War, more soldiers died from infection than in battle. Until a nurse introduced sanitary practices still in use today.
Well, there we go. Nightingale comes alive in the 21st century. In this video, I see an idealized portrait of care where the nurse gets credit for sanitary practices before autoclaves were invented, and where the vulnerable soldier locks eyes with Nightingale in acknowledgement of the healing bond they share. I think you can see the light in both Nightingale's eyes and just a moment before in the soldier's eyes. So there is this sort of magical moment of contact between them. And I think that this really provides a kind of idealized portrait of care. I think admittedly, sanitary practices ease the casualty rate. That's documentable in what we know about the statistics Nightingale was working on after the Crimean War. And of course, this still helped keep down all of the deaths from things like typhus and I don't know that there was much instance of smallpox, but typhus and typhoid were two of the major killers during the Crimean War. I think that what this pharmaceutical ad does, unfortunately, is to paper over what Nightingale and not the icon really accomplished. First, that mortality statistics she compiled at hospital sites in the Crimea could actually help sway public opinion and consequently political actors to make sanitary improvements during the inevitable next war. And second, that her class status functioned initially as a draw to aspiring nurses, but ultimately created dynamics that stifled the team-based collaborative models that modern nursing has come to embrace. And third, that her insistence on the moral and religious deportment of early nurses, qualities that I believe she had to model to gain credibility with powerful men in the military, that these things actually stymied the acquisition of clinical knowledge and expertise that might have eased nurses' entry into a professional body. Nightingale, the icon, on the other hand, performed quite differently, standing in as the essential embodiment of care for those whose physical sacrifice in war gave them patriotic leverage and immunity. Even as political forces conspired to minimize Nightingale's evidence-based sanitary advice in the 1850s and 60s, the work of the icon, already enshrined in the public consciousness, made the systematic education of a new professional class of women a fait accompli. This system was not without its complications, given that more elite women would administer the work of more socially humble ones. But these tensions largely related to educational and not experiential attainments disappeared in time into the textures of nursing's public face, as I think this Johnson & Johnson ad indicates. That face, of course, instantly recognizable as Nightingale's own, presented itself with the help of evolving 19th century media and the arts to make the case, at least at the dawn of the professional era, that women were best suited to tending the individual and the national body. Well, in closing, let me go back to there. In closing, I want to emphasize that this research is ongoing. I'm seeking other visual forms of iconography that can attest to the saturation of the Nightingale image in the 1850s and 60s. For example, I'm on the trail right now of the Nightingale School correspondence to see whether the school stationery included the silhouetted image of Nightingale, and to learn how widely such correspondence was disseminated. I've also found evidence of Nightingale dolls and all kinds of other popular culture objects, but most of these appear to have been 20th century phenomena. My main objective has been to allow visual culture exhibits in the form of physical representations to argue for the impact of such imagery on popular acceptance of nurses as a professional body. So I'll be grateful for your questions and observations as I continue to work on this material, and I'm going to ask Sarah to take it away.